Hello everybody, ask me anything you want.
Did you find a cash machine all right?
We did eventually. I don't know what's been going on with the cash machines in Blackpool this weekend, but a couple of nights ago there were none that were working we could find. I found one yesterday morning, and then in the evening it was out of order. I don't know if it's working now, but yeah, I don't know what it is with cash machines in Blackpool.
Tourists.
Yeah, probably. So have you all been to play TXK?
Yes.
A couple of times.
Really good.
So, do you want to ask me anything? Oh, that's the thing, is ask me anything.
How did you first get started?
I got started basically when I was...
Age were you actually?
I was what, 17 years old. I was at I was at sixth form college, and I had like one Commodore PET in the whole college.
Right.
And I wasn't even there on a computing course. I just happened to wander into this room one day and saw this lad playing some game on this thing which looked like a TV bolted on top of a typewriter. So I'm like, what the hell is that? How did that game get in there? And he said, I typed it in. And then I thought, you can type in video games? Because you must understand, before that I had no conception of video games as being something that you could actually create yourself. They were just things that were in boxes that you plugged into your TV or that you found in cabinets in arcades. Yeah. So this idea that you could actually somehow type stuff into a machine and get a game out was really intriguing. So I went and borrowed a book on BASIC from the library, and I went home and really obviously didn't have a computer at home. My brother had a programmable calculator, a TI-51 I think it was. And there was a little booklet of programs that came with that, and I nabbed that, and using the BASIC book and looking at that I managed to like transcribe a biorhythm program from calculated language into BASIC, which I'd never used before. Went in early the next day, sat down in front of this machine. Once I figured out where the on switch was, started typing lines of code into it, it didn't work. But then the lad I'd seen the previous day playing games when it came in to have us turn on the machine, and he helped me out and showed me where the errors were, and between the two of us we got it going.
Really? Right.
And then it just kind of grew from there. I mean, there were only about 4 people in the entire sixth form college who were actually into computers, who were, we were the nerds.
Yeah.
And so we all kind of learnt from each other, we all wrote games for each other to play, and it started there. There was never any thought at all about it being commercial. I mean, the fact that there were only 4 nerds in the entire college meant that it was a pretty obscure hobby for us, really. And it was only a couple of years later when stuff like the Simco ZX80 came out and then the ZX81 that there started to be a computer game scene at all. I was able then to apply the stuff which I'd learned just hacking around with my nerd friends in college towards writing my first games, which were published on the ZX81 by DK-Tronics. I did a couple more things for DK-Tronics on the VIC-20 when I got VIC-20.
Right.
But then basically I fell out with DK-Tronics over a couple of things, and we decided to start our own thing up, and Llamasoft was formed in 1982. But basically it just started out of just some nerds playing around in sixth form college.
What made you choose Llamasoft?
There's actually a bit of a peculiar story behind that. One of the things I did when I was hanging out with the nerds, obviously I decided that at one point I would like to have my own computer, but I didn't have any money. So I took a job cleaning offices and toilets at Lancing Bagnall, which is a forklift truck factory in Basingstoke. And I used to clean these offices at night. And one night I was going through there and I found a book of dirty stories that had been discarded in the bin of some executive. And of course, I'd had this book of dirty stories when I was reading various other things. And one of the stories mentioned in a rather dubious context an animal called a llama that I really didn't know much about. And wanting to know what was going on, I looked up llama in an encyclopedia and saw this weird looking animal with a long neck and a little fluffy tail. I thought, that's kind of a cool thing. And for a few years that thought lay dormant in my head, and then one day I was sitting at home writing stuff on the VIC-20, and I'd written a little pixel editor to do graphics. When I was doing graphics for a 3D maze game, I remember, and I was doing like Pink Floyd logos to go on the wall. We'd been thinking about doing starting our own company at that point, and I just doodled out this little doodle of a llama, and underneath it said "Llama Soft" with 3 exclamation marks. I thought, okay, why
You
not?
said that, not llama sex.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't want to put it into a dubious context. Obviously, I don't think that would have gone down too well. But yeah, it just seemed like people calling software houses all kind of stupid things. When there's rabbit software as well, I can have rabbits, I can have bloody llamas. You know, why not? So I mean, it's daft, but that's where it all began, just from some little doodle.
Glad to see you started without me, everybody. I'm very pleased about that because we've got so many things we want to ask Jeff. I'm absolutely sure of that. Got tied up with a cosplay masquerade and a thing and a thing and a thing. None of that's interesting. I'm just apologising for not having been here when we started. Let's carry on. Questions for Jeff then. I mean, it's unusual to get an Ask Me Anything opportunity with a total industry legend. So you are game, aren't you, Jeff, to ask whatever people like, which is great. You usually only get these things on Reddit and stuff like that, and that's great when they happen. But Reddit, I'd much rather be in a room with a load of other gamers. Yes, sir.
What do you find the most challenging thing about Oculus Rift development?
There you go.
Well, for one thing, you have to basically render every scene twice. So it means effectively you've got to do twice the work that you would do on a conventionally projected game. So it means that you have to be very efficient in rendering your geometry if you're going to keep the frame rate up. Because the moment you start to drop frame rate, then it starts to look choppy, and that really spoils the illusion. You have to have that perfect frame rate. Plus the Oculus Rift natural refresh rate is 75 Hz, so you're already in advance of what most TV stuff does, then you have to do it twice. So you've got to be pretty efficient, you've got to be really careful to keep things fast. I mean, we're very fortunate in that we work in the abstract, so we don't have to try and make things look realistic, so we can get away with low poly situations and special effects that aren't particularly heavy. But yeah, just keeping it fast enough to run clean on the Oculus is probably the main challenge.
Anybody not familiar with the Oculus Rift? Everyone know what that is? A few people tired on a Monday afternoon thinking, I thought we were asking the questions, what to do? So how did you get involved with Oculus Rift? Because that's a very modern thing. Did they come to you and say we want your input, or did something about it inspire you?
Basically it happened, I mean I'd heard about it, but for one thing, I can't see in stereo myself. I have these wonky eyes, you probably noticed. So I hadn't really thought maybe it would work very well for me. But a friend of mine a couple of years ago was passing through and stopped by my place for a couple of days, and he'd been to a convention, and he brought his Oculus Rift with him to show people at this convention he'd been to. And so he brought it to our house and plugged it into his laptop, and I had a go, and I realised that actually it does work for me, because even though I don't see in stereo 3D, I still get the effect of being able to look around and that kind of stuff. All that stuff still works.
So you see a flat 2D plane, but your point of view, you're moving the view.
Yeah, but basically, I mean, yeah, I don't see 3D, but I get parallax cues. So there's nothing I can't do because of this thing with my eyes. It's just a weird quirk, really.
Right.
But having played with his Oculus Rift, I thought actually this could be quite fun to look at. So I ordered one myself, and at first I didn't really do much with it. I was just playing around with all the demos. But I found it quite fascinating. And then a bit later on, Sony asked me if I'd like to play with one of the early Morpheus prototypes. And I thought, yeah, actually, I would quite enjoy playing one of those.
So you have?
Yeah, and well, actually the first VR work I did was originally done on the Morpheus. I thought, if they're going to give me one to play with, I better actually show willing and actually try it out and see what I could do. So I made the Minotaur Rescue version that I made was originally done on the Morpheus. Of course, we couldn't release it on the Morpheus because there are no Morpheuses around in the general public's hands at the moment. So I then ported it to Oculus, released it on the Oculus, and the guys from Oculus saw what we'd done and quite liked it, and offered us the chance then to get involved in developing some stuff for the Samsung Gear VR. So I did a version of Minotaur Rescue for the Samsung Gear VR, and from there, I mean, obviously when the DK2 came out, I wanted to get the DK2 because it was a lot better than the DK1.
That's the Oculus Rift dev kit do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is quite a big step up
It's a
from
big change in frame rate and resolution of the screens.
Yeah, the screens are much higher resolution. It's an OLED screen, so you get very deep blacks and very vibrant colours, and there's no blur. And the frame rate's very high at 75 hertz, so the virtual worlds feel very solid. The early versions of VR suffered quite a bit from perceptible lag when you turned your head and blurring on the LCD screen. And you just don't get that on the DK2. Everything's really, you can turn your head as fast as you like and everything is solid. It looks really good.
And was there any ideas that you'd had maybe related to games you'd published or gaming ideas that you'd thought of years ago and had never published? When you realised VR was now becoming a reality and actually really good VR, if you haven't tried out any of these kits, there are some Oculus Rifts in our gaming hall. Do have a go. Project Morpheus is Sony's version, and you say Gear VR is coming out from Samsung. In fact, that may even be slightly available. Were there any ideas, old or new, that when trying this technology you thought, now I can bring this to life?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was most interested in doing was doing the whole Tron thing. I mean, what a lot of people are doing with VR at the moment is simulating realistic worlds, and that's great. I mean, there's always going to be scope for that. But there weren't that many people doing like purely abstract stuff, and I wanted to have that kind of Tron experience, like being inside a 1980s coin-op arcade machine. And so that's why when I did, if you look at the graphics of Minotaur Rescue, it's all kind of very asteroids-like, and I wanted to pursue the abstract stuff and just have this feeling of being inside a coin-op machine, being inside this neon world, a bit exactly like in the Tron movies, really. And also, I think that kind of stuff is quite a good introduction to VR for people, because if you're inside a virtual world which pretends to be realistic, then you have a lot of expectations about how things are going to behave because of the way things behave in the virtual world. In the real world, you expect them to behave the same way in the virtual world. And so when they don't, that can create a conflict, that can create a kind of jarring feeling, it can make you feel uncomfortable, unsettled, or even ill at times. Whereas if you're in an abstract world, you're just floating in a space full of neon vectors and that kind of stuff, then you don't have those same kind of expectations, and so you can be a bit more free with what you do inside the virtual world. You can be a bit more adventurous. And that, to me, it remains my main interest in VR. I mean, I'll play other people's realistic stuff and really enjoy it, but my own personal interest in it is to explore these abstract worlds and to be able to see things and inhabit spaces that could only exist in VR.
I'm now going to do something that may seem a little bit odd, but we are filming this, and would you mind if we pretended to start again? Consider it thinking time for more questions. So I'm glad you got cracking, because I know we've got lots of things we want to ask you, Jeff, but for the sake of the cameras and Atari and people who we're working with here at Play Blackpool, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, of Play Blackpool, for coming along to our final of our talk sessions over our 3 days here in Blackpool. And we're ending it with an absolute industry legend. So many people have heard of him, so many people have been asking about him, and we've finally got him here, and to do nothing less than an Ask Me Anything talk, all the burning questions that we've ever had to ask somebody who's been around for so much of the gaming industry, seen the launch of so many platforms, seen the death of many ideas as well, and played and invented games that have stuck with so many of us. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please put your hands together and welcome the one and only legend that is Jeff Minter. And no less than you deserve, Jeff, as well. Thanks, everyone. More questions? That's how TV works. Yes, sir.
I've got one question, because I'm a great big fan of Tron, and I preferred the first version to the second version for the fact that the first version felt more real in the fact that you could drift around and feel like you were in there, but the modern version you felt a bit lost in it with the spikes, because with the modern twist.
Sorry, which game?
The Tron film.
Oh, the Tron film.
Oh, the
yes,
film.
Yeah.
You mean Tron Legacy? That came out, Tron Legacy?
Yeah, Tron Legacy. Because the first one.
So you prefer the original film?
Yeah, it was more of a computer simulation.
Yeah.
And then the second one was
Okay.
it was a modern twist on the first one, but I don't find it worked as well.
Are there any, so taking that to a gaming culture, have you seen any games that have been reinvented in new versions and you think the older versions were still better? Yours or other people's?
Oh, let me think there. I mean, I've seen quite a few reinventions of games that I think have done better. I mean, and stuff like Super Stardust 3D and that kind of stuff is obviously a remake of Asteroids, which is far better than the original. Mind you, having said that, Asteroids itself is a stone cold classic and still pleasurable to play to this day. But the other way around, I mean, just trying to think. I mean, there's stuff like, I suppose, I mean, things like, there are 3D versions of R-Type and things like that, which are okay, but I think the original probably works better, because some things just work better in 2D. That's just the way they were designed. And I think you can't necessarily force everything into 3D and expect it to work well. It doesn't really work that way.
That's going to extend into VR as well, isn't it? You're not going to stick everything on an Oculus Rift and make it better.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to be really careful putting stuff in VR. I mean, when the DK1 headset first came out, there was a rush to like make first-person shooters work on it. And yes, you can do that, but the trouble is that you end up getting ill, because a lot of the motions that you make in a first-person shooter, like the very rapid turning that you do, simply does not translate well to VR. It actually gives you motion sickness, because that's not the way that you move in real life. And as I was saying earlier on, you've got this expectation of seeing a realistic world. You expect things to feel fairly similar to the way they do in the real world. And so when you get these whiplash turns, your body kind of rebels against it. And I think what people are finding now with first-person stuff in VR is that you have to be guided by the way your body works. You can't really move or turn faster than the way your head does without risking to get this conflict, which gives you simulated sickness.
As a developer, did you work on anything to try and combat that, or did you find it just didn't apply to the things you've been making?
We've just been really careful not to have those kind of motions in our games. I mean, having played with all the demos, I realised what made me feel sick, and I just tried to exclude that. I think Carmack at one point said that he wished that they would just ban the use of yaw on the joystick when you're in VR, because that is the major culprit of making you feel sick. If you use the first-person shooter controls with like motion on this side and rotation on this side, then the rotation side, especially the yaw rotation, is absolutely the thing which generates about 90% of the sickness. And by simply removing that from your game, you can go most of the way towards making it comfortable to use in VR. This chap over there wants to ask something.
As somebody studying programming at the moment and trying to get to the game industry, what advice would you give? Because we know the game industry is quite hard to get into these days.
Well, I mean, at least there are some good tools you can use. There's stuff like Unity and Unreal Engine 4 and things like that, which you can use, which mean that even stuff like Game Maker, which mean that you don't have to be like a super duper coder in order to at least start producing stuff. And apart from that, I would say really just like build stuff with that and get it out there, get it seen, put it up on various sites and get people to play it. I mean, part of the problem is visibility, and the only way you can really achieve visibility is just by shoving stuff out there and getting people to have a look at it. That's all you can do, really.
Things like Unreal Engine 4 are free, aren't they?
Yeah,
it's free now.
They're pretty much free to use. I think they impose some restrictions and expect some kind of payment when you start to use them commercially. But certainly, in order to learn and start doing some demo games, they're free to use, which is good.
Yes, there was a question from the man over there.
Sorry, can't see each other. What do you think about the role of narrative in game design? Do you think it's important?
It depends on what kind of game you're making, really. Certain games are story games, and obviously you need strong narrative in those. Certain other games are just purely experience games. I mean, all the stuff I do doesn't really have a story at all. I think the strongest story I've ever had in any of my games is probably, the Xiaxian Revenge of the Mutant Camels, or the story of Gordon Bennett in Hoverbomber. There's not really a lot to it. The stuff I do tends to be more about plugging into the direct experience of putting you into a specific state of mind. Which doesn't really need any kind of narrative, but that's not to say that narrative isn't important. It just depends on the genre that you're addressing with your game design, I think, really.
To follow up on that, do you think there's elements, not as in a scripted narrative, but in the narrative of the level design and the progression that you do include within your developments?
I just make what feels good, really. I mean, the stuff I do is very much ad hoc. I just chuck stuff together, and I kind of pare away the bits which don't work. I don't really work in a very traditional way. I don't sit down and storyboard things and say, oh, this is going to be like this and this is going to be like that. I have like a vague idea. I strike out in that direction. I start doing stuff, and eventually it starts to click and come together and form a game. And I've always worked that way, from just like a rough idea, and I'll make it up as I go along.
How many people do you work with now, Jeff?
I basically work with it's just me and Ivan.
Yeah.
There's two of us, and obviously I do work with some musicians as well. The guys who did the soundtrack for TXK were an awesome bunch of musicians who basically just got together on the Larmasoft forum and did some outstanding work for free. It was remarkable.
Was that like inspired by previous games of yours?
Well, I told them I was doing TXK, which is a spiritual successor to Tempest 2000, and so obviously they were inspired by that kind of 90s rave music culture that was embodied in the soundtrack of Tempest 2000. And I said, let's do a new set of tunes around that same kind of vibe. And what amazed me really was that this was just a bunch of guys, none of which knew each other, on this forum. Everybody worked together, and all the tunes fit together so well. I mean, I can't remember how many musicians worked in it, probably about 12 or 13 musicians, and the whole album fits together really well.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Where are those forums if people want to chat with other people who are fans of your work?
It's yakyak.org.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you called it that. Yes, the gentleman over there.
I know you had with Space Draft on the Xbox, and there was a bit of tension afterwards, I believe.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider going back onto a Microsoft console? Or?
Yeah, but I don't see why not. I mean, I think.
For those who don't know, Jeff, do you mind giving us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, I mean, I did Space Giraffe. What was it? It came out in 2007. I did it on the Xbox 360. And the thing is, in places like Microsoft, there's a really high turnover of staff a lot of the time, and because the work I'd done before that was I did the light synthesizer that's built into the Xbox 360, and at the time I did that, the guy who was in charge of Xbox Live Arcade was all super keen on getting people like me onto the Xbox Live Arcade, and so I did Space Giraffe with that. But then during the course of the project, the boss of Xbox Live Arcade changed, the kind of direction of Xbox Live Arcade changed. They introduced this two-tier system where they wanted to push indies towards, what was that other thing called, Xbox, what's it called now? There was like an indie layer where you could publish stuff, but it wasn't very well publicised. It was kind of well hidden behind the interface on the Xbox. It wasn't very easy to get to. It certainly wasn't as accessible as Xbox Live Arcade. And I got the impression they just didn't want my kind of stuff on there anymore. But now again, things have changed again. I think they're being much more accessible again with the Xbox One. I think they've taken a leaf out of Sony's book, and they've seen how much goodwill Sony got from being so proactive in encouraging indies to develop on PlayStation, that they want to do the same thing on Xbox One. And I certainly wouldn't be averse to going on Xbox One. I've got no particular grudge towards them. It wasn't anybody's fault, really. It was just the changing staff and changing priorities.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because there are some people in the PlayStation community who think that Microsoft led the way with the indies and Sony were playing catch up with them, which Sony have done very well, as you say, with PS4. There's so many more indie releases on the PS4 than you could argue there were on the PS3. You mentioned Morpheus already. That's Sony's dedicated VR gear to go with PS4. Are you doing any PlayStation stuff as well as Morpheus, or separate to that?
Yeah, I mean, we are doing some stuff. I can't really talk about the current project, but yes, we are doing some stuff. We do have Morpheus dev kits.
Well, PlayStation owners, I'm excited to hear about that. Yes, sir.
What's a week in the life of Jeff Winter, if you please?
There's a great question.
Well, it basically involves I get up in the morning, I have a cup of tea, and then it's time for the first morning sheep visit. I'm going to go out and give the sheep their breakfast.
This is going to be in real time.
These days I always do, whenever I go out and tend to the sheep, I do a Periscope broadcast of it as well, so that people can see my sheep. I come back in, have a cup of coffee, then I'll go out and lead the sheep down to the bottom field and give them all their morning cuddles. Then it's generally back in and coding all day until sort of mid-evening when it's time to bring the sheep in. Bring in the sheep, we normally have our supper around then as well, and normally I'll head off down the pub for an hour, sit down at the pub for a while, chat with my friends from the village, then come back home, probably maybe play a bit of Skyrim. I have an hour of Skyrim a day. I've got a game of Skyrim that's been going on forever.
Oh, when did you start?
I started, let me think, I think it was August 2013.
And you've played an hour a day since then?
And I've played well, actually, there have been periods, like in the summer last year, I didn't play too much, but I've got right back into it recently, and it's just, at the end of coding every day, we have an hour of Skyrim. And I'm getting to the point where I'm near the end of the main quest line now, and I just don't want to go any further with that because I don't want to finish it too soon. And so I'm doing all the other quest lines. I'm the archmage of the College of Mages, and I'm the boss of the Thieves Guild, and I'm just doing the companions, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to rig everything I can out of that game and, until the next Elder Scrolls game comes out because I love it so much. And I've even got. I play on the PC. I don't run any real game-changing mods except for one. I have one that gives me a follower that's a Minotaur. And so I go everywhere with a grunting Minotaur. It's fantastic.
Letting you off for summer, that sounds like about 500 hours of Skyrim at an hour a day. Still not finished. That's good value for money, isn't it?
I've often said I think that's probably the best value for money game I've ever had because I just love it so much. And I actively don't want to do it, so I just go around and do piddling little requests every now and again, just to keep it going.
Brilliant. You said you would be coding all day. Sheep, cuddles, and more sheep later on, and in between coding. How do you do it? Are you the sort of programmer who can sit down with or without headphones and pause out of you, or do you follow the Pomodoro method and work for 25 minutes and stop for 5? How does it work for you, Jeff?
I can generally just sit down and code all day. If I feel I'm getting stressed or I feel I need to think, then sometimes I'll just go out and visit with the sheep for 10 minutes. I mean, it's always very calming and nice to go out and sit with the sheep for a little while. Maybe do another little periscope when I'm out there. But no, basically, once I'm sat down at the keyboard, I'm quite content just to sit there with my head down all day and get on with it because I love the headspace of coding. Okay. It feels really lovely when you're in there and you've got all the state in your head and you just know where everything's going. I love the act of writing code. I think that's one of the reasons I've never given up is because I don't want to be a manager. I want to actually be at the code phase because I really, really enjoy it.
I like the term the code phase. I've not come across that before. Maybe some of you have. I like that very much. Yes, you've been having a head of what, sorry.
Your favourite game of all time and why?
There you go.
Oh, that's such a toughie.
You must have been asked that before.
Yeah, I know, but it's
not
really...
Skyrim.
Yeah, not Skyrim. No, I think I've had to dig deep and really think about one game that absolutely blew me away when it came out and still I consider to be absolutely astonishingly good to this day, is Star Raiders on the 8-bit Atari. It was such a fantastic amount of game for such a small amount of memory. It was coded in 8K, and it informs all kinds of space games that came after it. You know, even stuff like Elite can definitely trace its roots back to Star Raiders. And it was just an absolute genius bit of programming, and it's quite astonishing to think. I believe that Doug Newbar, who made it, I think he started coding it in 1977. So we are talking something from the dawn of time. But if you sit down and fire it up an emulator to this day, it is still a challenging and excellent space game.
Tell us what that was again. So we've got it. It's
Star Raiders on the 8-bit Atari.
Right, emulators away, everyone. Yes, sir.
Obviously, with a lot of your games, you do the shoot 'em up genre. Well, I'm interested that because you mentioned Skyrim and that. Have you ever thought of doing a different genre?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind trying. I've thought of like combining the shoot 'em up genre with other stuff. Like I often thought I'd quite like to combine like a roguelike with a Robotron style shooter. But I think there are people also doing that kind of thing already. So perhaps I'll be covering ground which has already been covered, and it would be worth it. But I've also enjoyed doing other kinds of games at times. One of my favourite games of my own creation is, well, I say my own creation. It was designed between me and my dad. Was Hoverboffer. I love that game. And it was a radical departure at the time from the shooting games that I'd been making, but I loved it because it was like a nicely balanced, silly game full of humour, and it was more of a Pac-Man or a paintery game, I suppose. But I like that, and perhaps one day I'd like to explore a bit more in that direction too.
You said you were working with your dad?
My dad was, I turned him into a gamer because I bought an Atari VCS when I was in university. I actually blew a whole term's grant on buying a VCS and then spent the rest of that term living on baked beans. Perhaps it wasn't the most sensible thing to do, but I just wanted.
Turned out pretty well for you.
I wanted a VCS so badly, and so I brought this thing home. And my parents had been out when I arrived back. My parents were out, and so while they were out, I hooked this thing up to the telly. And when they got back, I was sitting there playing Space Invaders, and I said to my dad, come on, you got to go to this. He's like, no, I'm too old for these video games. I can't do that. No. I had to twist his arm. I gave him the joystick. And I didn't get it back for about 3 hours. And it turned him into a gamer, basically. After that, every time I bought a new game system, I would buy one for my dad as well. And he'd have a PC Engine for Christmas. He had his own room. My mum used to say that she was a video game widow because what used to be like my coding room when I was still at home at Larmosoft, we had an extension built onto the house where like Larmosoft offices were. And when I moved out, that became my dad's games room. And so he'd have all his systems laid out in there. But anyway, my family were really all quite deeply involved in Larmosoft. They'd always help out at shows. My mum did basically just about all the business paperwork of Larmosoft. And they'd all come up and help at the computer shows we would go to. And one day we were staying, I think there was a show up in Birmingham, and we were staying in this very nice place. It was in Solihull, I think it was. And it was an old farmhouse really, with some very nice formal gardens. It was like a rich person's house, but you could actually pay to stay in their bed and breakfast. And one morning we were sat there having a lovely breakfast, scrambled eggs on toast, the full works, and looking out the window. It was a lovely day, and there was some groundsman outside going up and down with a lawnmower. And so I said to my dad, I reckon you can make a game out of that. And between the two of us, we started tossing these ideas around. The idea of the neighbour who wanted his lawnmower back and you borrowed it, but he wanted it back, so he was chasing you around. And then yes, you could have the family dog, which you could set on a neighbour, and then you have the dog that would get fed up at the sound of the lawnmower after so much time and turn and attack you, but it would still have a certain amount of loyalty. But if you commanded it too much, then loyalty would run out, and it just all grew from there. In the space of about 5 minutes, we kicked this thing back and forth and had the whole thing designed. And the only thing that we didn't have was the name. And we were driving in to go to the show, and I remembered the Qualcast adverts for the lawnmowers, and they used to have this slogan like, "It's a lot less bother than a hover." I thought, it's got to be hover bother, really. And what was a shame was that at one point we actually were on the verge of having the approval of Flymo. We approached Flymo and told them we were producing this game, and they actually gave us a promotional Flymo to take to one of the exhibitions we were going to, and we had the permission to use the name Flymo in the game. But then I can't remember. So again, there was a staff change, and the new guy came in and said, "No, you can't do this." So at the last minute, we had to take the name Flymo out. We still kept the mower, and we gave it to my brother. But it was very almost an official Flymo game.
Who thought they would hear Jeff Minter say he nearly got into corporate sponsorship with Flymo? I am going to take some questions from you gentlemen, but is there anybody who hasn't asked a question yet who would like to? Yes, you sir, right at the front.
How did you get into developing for the Atari Jaguar?
Oh, actually, that's quite an interesting story. I mean, I got in touch with Atari UK back in the ST days. They made it very easy. I mean, at the time, when the Commodore Amiga came out, the Amiga 1000, Commodore weren't very welcoming to game developers. They wanted to promote their machine as a business machine. And Atari, on the other hand, were the diametric opposite. They really wanted to get machines into our hands as quickly as possible. So through that kind of connection, I got to know some of the guys in Atari UK. And I ended up doing some games for Atari UK. I did a Photon Storm, and I did Defender 2 for them. And so I had a working relationship with them. And then when the Falcon came out, they naturally wanted me to do a game for the Falcon, so they got me like an early version of the Falcon. It was called the Sparrow, I think it was. It wasn't a complete Falcon, but.
You're saying sparrows are small falcons?
Yeah.
Or Atari are telling us that anyway.
So yeah, I was already working with them, and So I remember I went to collect this, I think the first real version of the Falcon. They were bringing 3 of them over to Germany, and I went up to Atari HQ in Slough to collect one of these machines. And they said, oh yeah, the chief system architect of the Falcon is here, you know, do you want to meet him? I said, yeah, sure. And the guy comes in, it's my best mate from school. I couldn't believe it, because the last time I'd seen him, I tried to lend him my ZX80, and he wasn't very interested in computers at that point, because you know, it wasn't cool. He was much more interested in going off and being cool. So I never even thought he had any interest in computers, but it turns out he got into the business as a hardware designer. And like through circuitous routes had come to Atari US that way, and so he ended up being the chief system architect of the system I was working on. I couldn't really believe it. But anyway, after that they had there was a system coming out called the Atari Panther, which was intended to be a competitor to the Super Nintendo, I think. And they wanted people doing games on there. I'd already done a few games for Atari UK, and so they asked me if I'd like to get involved in developing stuff on there. I submitted a spec for a game design to them there, which was a bit almost like an extended Star Raiders. And they said yeah, and they gave me a dev kit. I was working on that. And it was actually quite a nice machine. It was primarily sprite based. It had a very good sound chip and an Ensoniq sound chip that was, I believe, designed by Bob Yanis, the same guy who designed the SID chip in the Commodore 64. But anyway, we've been working on prototype stuff on that for about 3 months, and then I got the message that actually they weren't going to release the Panther at all. They were going to can the Panther. I was a bit upset because obviously I've done 3 months work on it. But then they said, but there's this new thing, it's called the Jaguar. The reason that we canned the Panther is because we've got this thing called the Jaguar, and it's absolutely fantastic. And went up to DevCon, and they showed us the Jaguar, I told us the specs, and it sounded pretty good. And it all went from there, really. I remember I was invited out to Sunnyvale to code up some of the first demos of the Jaguar, where it was still all hush-hush prototype hardware. I remember I had to go into this special locked room in Borregas Avenue where they kept all the gear, and being very jet-lagged and sitting down in front of this thing for the first time and trying to wring some demos out of it. And at one point, Jack Trammell himself came through and had a look at what I was doing. He pointed at the screen and said, "That's the best stuff I've seen on the Jaguar so far." And I was like, yes. If I can do that when I'm jet-lagged, I'm all right, I think. And then there was the famous DevCon where basically they were offering up various IP, Atari IP, for people to, they said basically stick your hand up if you're interested in doing a Jaguar version of these games, and they called out Tempest, and I said, yes please, I'll do that, because I love Tempest. I had no idea how to do 3D polygonal graphics at all at that time. I'd been purely a sprite-based guy, so I waved my hand enthusiastically, but thought, how the fuck am I going to do this?
And you had nothing to do with the original Tempest?
No, the original Tempest was done by Dave Toira. I mean, I'd fallen in love with that one rainy day in London, I think, I can't remember, 1982 or something like that. Just walking down the street, and it was raining, and there was this little dim arcade, and I ducked into this arcade, thought, okay, let's get out of the rain and maybe play some games, and there was just this glowing vector beauty over in the corner of the arcade, and I was like, whoa, what is that? I've got to play that. The moment that I first dropped coin in that thing, I was like, yes, this is fantastic. So I was already in love with it.
Yourself and then yourself.
My idol's Borheim. Who's your idol in the industry?
Oh, I would say probably, Eugene Jarvis has always been massive inspiration to me. Ever since I first saw a Defender machine, the first time you ever saw a Defender, especially if you're used to the arcade games that came before, normally in the arcade games of that period, when you shot something, you just get a little sprite that represented the explosion. But the first time I saw a Defender, when he shot something, it blew apart like fireworks. It blew apart into its component atoms, and it was sort of, whoa. Plus the sound effects were just intense, really deep and intense and terrifying. And the game itself was hard as nails. I mean, I must have put about sort of like £2.50 into it before I could even get off the first level. It kicked my ass, but I ended up loving it so much. I'm like, wow, I so want to design games that feel like that just have those kind of fireworks to it, and and just the rush that I got from playing that became my major inspiration. And I found out that the chief designer of those games was this chap called Eugene Jarvis, and I followed, of course, his work following that, and he came out with stuff like Robotron, which is even better. And I was like, wow, this guy is amazing. I was very fortunate in that I got to meet him when I was actually living in the US a few years later, and he was gracious enough to spend the afternoon hanging out with me and buying a few beers. He bought me a few beers, and I got a picture of him playing Tempest 2000, and just made my life at that point. I could actually hang out with Eugene Jarvis, and he was just such a cool guy.
Thanks for that. Yes, you and Todd.
You talked about how you got into programming, but me personally, I'd like to do programming, but it never seems to work out, so I went into the gaming side and then played tremendously a lot of games for a long time. So, where did your passion lie when you first started? Does it lie with gaming or designing, or is it a bit of both for you?
It was a bit of both, really. I mean, it was just this revelation. I mean, I've been playing games before that. I used to skype off sixth form college and meet up with other lads at a record shop where they had a Space Invader machine, and every spare moment, and even lots of illicit moments were spent in front of that machine. But there was never a connection between like games being something that you could actually create yourself, and understanding that that was possible is what kicked off my interest in programming. And then, as I said, I really enjoy the headspace that programming puts you in. I mean, some people enjoy doing crossword puzzles and that kind of thing. Some people enjoy playing chess, and I guess it's for much the same reason. There's a very comfortable space when you're entirely inside your own head, just considering these structures and these state machines and figuring out what you're going to do. It just feels lovely in there. And the fact that I could enjoy that and at the same time create games was, it was like a drug to me. I couldn't stop. I mean, it was. I used to get up early in the morning and like ride my bike into college so I could be first in there. I'd arrive at college at 7:30 in the morning, and I'd be the last one to be kicked out at night because I just had to have my fix of this every day.
Did you ever program anything that wasn't a game? Did you ever work on any applications?
I've done things like, I used to do things like character designers and stuff like that, which I used to use to make my games. At one point, when I was first learning to program, I wrote some little simple account management thing for my dad, but it was really, really terribly simple. At one point I was almost going to work for DK-tronics, and the first thing they wanted me to do there was again write some kind of accounting thing. But I did like 2 days work on there, and then I found out the guy who ran it was a complete twat, so I left and did my own thing.
So you weren't programming things and then gaming came along, and you thought, oh, I can write games, amazing. Gaming was where you started out.
Yeah, gaming was,
when you taught yourself
gaming was in my head first, and the whole computer thing was completely incidental. If I hadn't seen that guy playing a game on a Commodore PET, I would never have even connected the two things. I mean, computers at that stage to me were things that sent you your gas bill. Games were things that were boxes that you plugged into your telly or that were in big cabinets in the arcade. I had no conception of how games were actually made. And the thing that was the revelation was that guy telling me that he typed in a game. At that point, the light went on in my head, kind of like, ah.
So what was the first time you created a game and you were happy with it and you decided you'd try and get it published? How did that come about?
Basically, it came about almost by accident. I used to go to the ZX Micro Fairs, and one time I went down there, I had some ZX81 games that I'd written, and I took a cassette tape with me just to show people if there was anybody interested. And I was there, and I went to the DK-tronics stand and got talking to the guy there, because they had some 16K memory boards, which I couldn't afford, but I was at a ZX Micro, I was obviously just looking around at everything. And the guy mentioned, he'd be interested in seeing any games I had, and I loaded up these games and showed him. And he said, oh, you reckon they can publish those games, and could I do some more games? And I said, yeah, but I haven't got much memory on my machine. And they gave me a 16K RAM board there and then. And that was the first time I'd ever got anything in return for a code that I'd written. I came home, I was so pleased. I remember telling my mum, look, I got this, and I didn't need
Did you give them a game? Did you swap the game for the board?
No, it was just, they did end up publishing those games, but they just gave me the board straight away. Right. We worked out the details for the publishing afterwards. They just gave me the board in order to make more games. but I came home so chuffed that I'd actually got a bit of hardware for, effectively for free, just to let me do more of this stuff which I already so much love doing.
Could I delicately ask you how old you were? You don't have to answer.
No, at that point, we see that would have been probably 1981, so I would have been, what, 19 at that point? Yeah.
That's a huge thing for a 19-year-old to have somebody involved in the industry go, yeah, we like these, and in fact we'd like to see you make more, and have this to try and do so.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, it was well, I was like, I was so chuffed.
That's a question of
We know that you started out programming basic and you were self-taught, but have you ever studied coding at college or university? And what course did you do?
Well, I mean, when I actually went to sixth form college, before the incident of me seeing the Commodore PET, I was there doing maths, physics and English, and you had to have like what they called a main study, which was definitely not the correct name, because your main study was just like a little throwaway thing which you were supposed to do on the side. And that actually enrolled me in a computing main study. But I never went to about 2 lessons of it, because the way in which it worked was you went in there and they told you like roughly, there was this language called Cecil, and like they would spend like one entire thing telling you how the print statement worked. And then in order to actually execute the code, they would bring around these forms that had boxes on, and you had to basically write your code in the boxes. They would gather up the forms and they would send them off to a place in the post, and they would come back the next week and they would tell you if there'd been a syntax error or not, and if it had run. And again, as I told you, at that point, my perception of computers was of things that sent you your gas bill. So this was very much in line with that. I did not connect that computing with anything to do with writing games at all. So I dropped out of that. I did not bother going to any of those things after about the second week. And it was only a couple of months later when I accidentally discovered the Commodore PET that I actually got involved in actual real programming and taught myself BASIC. And then after a couple of months, decided BASIC was too slow and taught myself assembler.
That's not easy to do at any age. Yes, you again.
Yeah, I'm studying at the moment an honours degree in software engineering and game development. I was just wondering, when you said that you're quite comfortable coding, at what point do you reach that point? Because sometimes, as you can see, I rip my hair out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes with experience and familiarity, really. I think there is a stage when you're first coding where you're almost like anxious about it, and you worry about whether or not you can actually get something, actually see the steps to achieve the result that you want. After a while, the more you do it, the more you realise that even if things seem difficult, you'll always find a way. There is no bug that will ever defeat you. There's no bug that's not resolvable, and you will find it. And you learn to depend on that. I mean, I've had some techniques, for example, that I've used. You can often fix bugs subconsciously. If I'm really up against a brick wall on something, I will go and do something else completely instead, or I'll just go to bed and leave it until the next morning. And 95% of the time, you will come back to it, and within 5 minutes, you'll have the solution. I remember this happening to me just before a computer show back in the 80s. I had some terrible bug. I remember it distinctly because it came on. It was just after EastEnders. I'd finished watching EastEnders, and I was going to do a bit more work on the I think it was one of my light synths I was going to be demonstrating at the show, and this terrible bug came out, and I panicked and I sat there all night. I did not sleep the whole night, and I was banging and banging and banging away at that brick wall. I did not solve the bug, and I was going crazy. I was literally getting really wound up, and I thought, I've just got to back off this. And at that time, I lived in a place called Cumkeek in Wales, a nice little valley, and there was a little pub about half a mile down the road. I thought, I'm going to walk down the pub, and I'm going to have a coffee, and then I'm going to go back. And I'm just going to chill out for half an hour. And I did that, and I came back, and I fixed it in 5 minutes. Sometimes you just got to back away and give your subconscious a chance to work on it, and it will work.
Anyone who's not asked a question yet, who's got a question? Yes. Hello.
Of the VR dev kits that you've been working with, do you have a preference? Do you find any of them easier to work with?
Well, so far I've only really worked with Oculus and Morpheus. I haven't tried the Valve one yet, and they've been more or less been keeping parity with each other. They both evolved. I mean, the first versions of both were noticeably crude. The second versions of both of them were vastly improved. We have actually seen the third version of the Morpheus, and it's really very good indeed. And I haven't yet seen a Crescent Bay, but everybody says who's seen the Crescent Bay says it's absolutely fantastic as well. I mean, I think the thing with VR is that before it goes fully commercial, they know it's got to work really, really well. So all the hardware manufacturers are working on making the final kits as excellent as they can be. They really are getting there now. The dev kits now are getting astonishingly good.
Is it easy to work on one and another? Porting between? You said you ported stuff from Morpheus to Oculus. Was that easy to develop for?
Yeah, it's not too bad because the basic techniques that you need for VR, basically the stereoscopic rendering and the head tracking are common to both platforms. I mean, obviously the APIs may be a bit different, but Giles has been working on an abstracted game engine where basically I get to interface with the front of his game engine. He then tailors the back end to work specifically with PS4 or the PC or Android or whatever. And yeah, but the actual techniques of VR are just by their very nature, they are in common to all the headset devices. So if you can support one, it's not too much of a stretch to support the others, provided you've got the engine back end on there as well.
Time for just a couple more. Yes, hello, sir.
Just going back to what you were saying about teaching yourself assembly because BASIC was too slow. I think back to, you know, the days of 1K chess and 3D Monster Maze on the ZX81 and how...
That's twice 3D Monster Maze has been mentioned today, and I had nightmares of that game as a child. So stop talking about 3D Monster Maze.
Well, amazing what could be squeezed out of the hardware. Do you think that with development shifting towards kind of frameworks and high-level languages, is that squeezing out a bit of a lost art these days?
Yeah, it is. I think it is to an extent, but I think one place where you still see it, where you see that kind of coding efficiency and excellence combined with supreme artistry is in the demo scene. The demo scene is absolutely stunning if you look at some of the stuff they do there. But yeah, I think these days you don't have to worry so much about speed because machines are so fast that it doesn't really matter if you're not that efficient. You don't have to worry so much about memory. And in a way, I kind of miss that. In fact, one of the things that I do a bit of hobby coding at the weekend. And one of the things I've just started doing, which I'm really enjoying, is doing some coding for there's a new Pebble smartwatch coming out, a colour one called the Pebble Time. And to code on that, you have to code in this really restricted version of C with no floating points. You've got to do everything in fixed point, and the code's got to fit inside 64K. And you've got to be really careful also with like frame rate because of battery management issues. But I actually find that really interesting and really fun.
That sounds like an era, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's really quite challenging and fun, and I'm also just having fun making like silly Llamasoft watch faces. I've got one which does like a different Commodore 64 sprite animation every hour, and it changes on the hour. I've got another one which actually runs Psychedelia on the watch.
Are you going to release any of that?
Yeah, of course I'm going to release it and the source code. It'll all be there for people to take for free, and the code will be there for people to hack around with as they see fit. It's just a bit of fun, hobby coding, you know.
64K in a frame rate, that's great. We are coming to the end of our session. If there are any more questions, anybody got something they've been wanting to ask and just haven't done? Go on. Yeah, we'll just a couple more.
What's the most difficult system you've programmed for?
Difficult, I'd probably say the Nuon.
The what?
The Nuon DVD player, because it had this very, very weird chip architecture where basically you had 4 CPUs on one die. The whole thing was clocked at 54 megahertz. There was no graphics acceleration at all. You had to do everything yourself. 3 out of the 4 CPUs only had 4K of memory. The data memory was completely separate from the instruction memory. You had to set up all your own DMAs. Basically, if you wanted to make something run, you had to basically split your task up amongst these 4 CPUs, and on the 4K ones, actually have like a massive overlay system that was page code in as you actually needed to come in to do what you needed to do. And on that system, I mean, if you look at, we were running it, there's a Nuon player on our stand. You'll see Tempest 3000 that's actually doing some tricks which these days you would do in pixel shaders, and we actually managed to get them out of that extremely weird architecture. But it was so strange, when you would come in the morning when you were testing something, you'd find that like a quarter of your machine had crashed. Because something gone wrong on one of these, like the processor elements they were called. And yeah, just getting that to work was extreme challenging. Plus, when I started out writing that game, I had 3.5 of the processor elements to myself. And by the time it got released, I think the operating system had taken 2 of those away from me, so I didn't have much of it left. But it was challenging, but it was very rewarding. So I had this fantastic assembly language where you could specify what was going to go on each of the function units on the chip per instruction. So each single instruction could have like 7 sub-instructions, but they could only fit together in certain ways. And you could spend like 2 days taking one tick off an inner loop. And I mean, to an assembler nerd, it was like nerd-tastic. It was really, really good. But one of the reasons the neural never took off was that most coders at the time only ever wanted to write something fairly simple in C, and so I think probably the only person who ever used that stuff in a game was probably me.
Did I see? Yes, I did see one behind. Let's go on and ask a question.
Yeah. I was really curious with the comic system, because that was unreleased, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'd love to know about what it was like and what you did on the system.
Yeah, it was. I think it started out being, I think it was 8080 based at first. What was nice about it was that it had a chunky colour display. It had a 1 byte per pixel display, which at the time was, well, I think VGA was starting to have it, but when you come up to this system off of a Commodore 64, it was really quite liberating being able to have 256 colours on the screen. There was a blitter on there, which was, it wasn't massively fast. I think it was a line-oriented blitter from what I recall, but it was certainly a step up from having to bang all those pixels by hand with an 8080. There was a weird DSP chip. I wrote my first ever DSP code on it, because you basically had to roll your own sound chip by programming this DSP chip, which I managed to do to a fairly primitive degree. I think it ended up with sort of about 8 voices of square wave or something like that. It wasn't particularly sort of audio elegant, but it did the job. And then they changed it, and it was going to be an 8086 instead of an 8080, which was good because it was a faster CPU. I never really used any of the special controller stuff that much. In my game, I was doing Attack of the Mutant Camels 89, and it was just controlled with a conic speaking, and despite that famous picture that I could never get away from of me sat in the chair with a light gun in my hand and my permed hair and everything. That picture, it comes back to haunt me all the time. I was just like, oh my God, man. Yeah, it was an interesting machine. It was a shame what happened. Basically, the guys who were making it ran out of money, and we first found out about it. They were supposed to be showing it at I can't remember, the PCW show, one of those shows in London. There was supposed to be a conic stand there. We were going to be showing AMC 89 and various other guys were going to be there. We just turned up and they just weren't there. It's like, oh, okay. And then we found out what had gone on, and it was a bit upsetting because I'd spent a fair bit of money on the actual kit itself. They hadn't given me the kit. I actually bought it. So it was a bit of a daft decision on looking back. But I still enjoy working on it. Even systems that have failed, I always enjoy working on, because I just enjoy working on new hardware. There's nothing I like more than somebody plunking down a prototype dev kit in front of me and saying, you know, here's a kit, here's some books, get on with it. I love that.
I'll have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please join me in thanking Jeff Minter so kindly being so willing to take whatever questions you want to ask him. It's a big and brave thing to do when you've had a career as illustrious as Jeff Minter's, and such an interesting person as well. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our guest, Jeff Minter. Thank you so much, Jeff.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here.
And you're still going to be in the gaming hall until the end of the day, aren't you?
No, actually we are heading out now because we need to get back to Wales. We've been away for 3 days, and the sheep need looking after. So we're going to head out now. So we're back in time for the evening feed tonight.
There you go. Okay, well, hopefully you've all had a chance to see Jeff's work in the gaming hall. Anyway, you have 2 hours left of Play Blackpool, everybody, so go and make the most of it. Thank you so much for coming to our talk, and hopefully you've come to any of our other talks over the last 3 days. Thank you so much for your attendance at those as well. We have some tournaments in about a quarter of an hour. They're going to finish. Our PES tournament, our Halo tournaments are going to go off at the back of the main gaming hall, and the trading hall is now closed. but you have 2 hours of free cabinets and free consoles, so do please go and make the most of them. Make sure you visit funstock.co.uk. They're just inside the main hall. They're our main sponsor. We couldn't do this without them. Go and check them out. Everybody who buys their Commodore Amiga book gets a free signed poster with it while you're here at Play Blackpool, so please go and see them as well. And if you're interested in our tournaments, like I say, they're in the back of the main hall. Get your game on, everybody. Got about 2 hours left of this fabulous bank holiday weekend. Thank you very much for joining us at Play Blackpool. Do come and see us in Margate. Do keep your eyes on playexpo.net as well to find out when you can come to our flagship show, 8 times the size of this one, up in Manchester in the autumn. We would love to see you there as well. Thank you so much, everybody. Go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.